All right, now, the church faced a whole lot of threats from the age of reason. For most of history, you didn't question the church, the existence of God, that sort of thing. And with the age of reason came a lot of questions. First was from Charles Darwin. I do, that's Archbishop Usher. Darwinism. Darwin studied medicine at Edinburgh and theology at Cambridge, but when he wrote The Origin of the Species, two things featured. The first was evolution, where man descends from the apes, and the second is the principle of the survival of the fittest. So evolution has got nothing to do with God. It's whoever is fittest who survives. Now that creates all sorts of problems for the church. Science has started to say, hang on a minute, we've got evidence that the world is millions of years old, so how do you put that in with the creation story? It's not helped by the fact that Archbishop Usher, who was an Irish archbishop, worked out from history and Genesis that the world was created at 6 p.m. on the 22nd of October 4004 BC. Okay, not bad. So you can see how people started to question what the church was saying, and in some instances rightly so. Then you had other philosophers like Immanuel Kant, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche. Immanuel Kant claimed to have swept away all the arguments for the existence of God that had been produced. I'm not sure that he did, but anyway. But he argued that the human mind can only cope with time and space. And I've got no problems with that. The human mind can only cope with time and space.
Is there anything else?
Well, there is. God is outside of time and space, so you see you can't understand God. Now, Christians say, hang on, yeah, that's faith. And whilst we can't understand it completely, doesn't mean it's not there. Kant said, well, you know he's talking about. So, for example, let's use one very simple illustration. The Bible sometimes talks about how things are going to happen instantly. Like when you die, you go straight to heaven. But then when the second coming arrives, you'll be sort of drawn up. What happens? That's where purgatory comes. Where are you in the meantime? But you see, it's because we are dealing with something that is outside of time and space. We can understand it. So let's assume this is a timeline. All right? I die here. Christ comes back here. Big gap between them. But you're sitting where God is. You can't see much of a gap, can you? Right? That's the problem. So we explain it in human terms because that's comforting, but in God's terms, same thing is true. It's just that we don't understand the time-space thing. And that led to Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was probably more important than all of them, theology based on human experience. So nothing outside of human experience as well, which takes away faith and everything else. Karl Marx is different. Karl Marx produced Das Kapital in 1867. Karl Marx was basically an economist. He used to teach high-level economics, and you'd have to do a segment on the history of economics. And in 1770, Adam Smith produced a book called The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was born in Kirkaldy, but that's beside the point. And 1770 is easy to remember because it was the year Captain Cook was going to Australia. Anyway, The Wealth of Nations was the first great economic textbook. everything in economics from then on stems from that, because every economist has actually tried to fiddle with what Adam Smith said and change it and that sort of thing. So all economics comes out of Adam Smith and makes changes. Well, Karl Marx made radical changes. History is about how man and material are created. There is no God. It's about the class struggle. You see, under wealth of nations, which is capitalism, some people get rich, other people get poorer. Poorer people, when they're bad enough, they get organised and they revolt against the rich people, and you have a revolution, and that creates communism. And in communism, you see, in order to get rid of the class struggle, everybody's equal. And there are all sorts of things in it, and communism can't work. One of the things is that everybody gives what they can to the economy and receives what they need from the economy. So put it in the simplest terms, all right? You are really intelligent, and you go on to university, you work really hard, you become a doctor. And because you become a doctor, you've been so tied up with that, you don't get married. Your next door neighbour as a child is pretty dumb, so he gets out of school as soon as he can, becomes a cleaner in a factory, gets married and has 6 kids. Who gets the most? The cleaner in a factory, because you've got 6 kids. The doctor gets very little because he doesn't need very much. Now, humans are humans. What do you think? Why am I spending all this time doing this and I'm not going to get anything for it? And so communism automatically means that a lot of very talented people never give what they should. What do, because, nationalism, we've got to do this for the nation, lots of things. That's one of the problems. And so the communist system has always got to be sort of fine-tuned. That's why there's corruption. The corruption gives the doctor his summer house and so on. See, that's just part of it. Nietzsche, God is dead. Man is liberated. And you need to discard Christian virtues because they are there to support the weak and the ailing. Which is why Nietzsche is the basic philosopher for the Nazis. Now the church is faced with this. These are big issues that the church has to look at. They also have attacks on the Bible. Julius Wellhausen in Germany from 1844 to 1910. He taught that the Old Testament undergoes change from stories of primitive times to the elaborate ritualism of later Judaism. So he says what you've got is simple stories, historical stories. But then as each age becomes more ritualistic, what they do is they write back into those stories their current rituals. And so what you have in the Old Testament is nowhere near the original. And so in the Old Testament law, the first 5 books of the Bible, he said different bits were written at different times. So he comes up with what's called the documentary hypothesis, JPD&E, and there are these 4 different strands in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. And so there is the Jewish strand, there's the priestly strand, and so on. Very, very big as the basis of biblical criticism. The other thing was the quest for the historical Jesus, different approaches, but most of them removed the supernatural, and Jesus becomes a magnetic teacher, Jesus the human being. The quest for the historical Jesus, and I have a book, there's a whole lot of very influential names there, but they basically reduce Jesus to a person like you and me. But he is very special because he's a great teacher. My problem always is he had 12 men 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 years. And at the end, they didn't understand what he was talking about. And what sort of teacher was he? If he taught all that time preparing them for the crucifixion and resurrection, and they didn't understand it. Anyway, they were the big movements. Opposing that, the Codex Sinaiticus, I probably spelled wrong, I think, was discovered in a monastery in Mount Sinai, one of the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, and showed that the manuscripts that had been used for translation were correct for the King James Version and so on. We don't have any original manuscripts, but the earliest manuscripts are likely to be the most accurate. But then as manuscripts are copied, mistakes occur, and often the bulk of the manuscripts are copied from one manuscript that had a mistake in it. But this discovery showed that the texts were pretty accurate. However, they were made more accurate by great scholars, B.F. Westcott, F.J.A. Hort and J.B. Lightfoot, and they produced a new Greek text based on new discoveries. Language and background help to explain. Now, Greek is an interesting language. It's different to English, very different to English. But like English, it changes over time. So, the Shakespeare plays of the early 17th century, we have trouble understanding. Shakespeare was one of the most literate men in history. The thing that made him great was that he had so many words that he used. If you picked up a copy of today's paper, he would be semi-literate, you wouldn't understand it, because language has changed. Now, with the humanists, the Reformation and so on, when the Bible was being translated, the thing that everybody knew about was classical Greek. Now, classical Greek was to New Testament Greek like Shakespeare is to us. And what happened is archaeologists found rubbish dumps with documents from New Testament times, like shopping lists and something, and that sort of thing. Not shopping lists, but you know, that sort of thing. And they discovered that the Greek of New Testament times was what was called Koine Greek. It was not classical Greek. And so suddenly a whole new world opens up of understanding based on the times. Now, what these great scholars did is they produced a text, Greek text of the Bible, that was far more accurate. And then William Ramsay showed the accuracy of Luke, and archaeological finds discovered supported the Bible. One classic one that I always remember was Solomon had this great cavalry with all these horses. Now the critical scholars of the late 19th century said, that's written much later because they didn't use horses in war in Solomon's time. Now what archaeologists have discovered, they've actually discovered Solomon's stables. A lot of horses there. And then, of course, as they've gone on, they've discovered horses were used centuries before Solomon. So, despite all the biblical criticism, there were scholars now starting to say, fight back and say, well, hang on. World War I, first total war, evolution means man is getting better. So at the end of World War I, it's the war to end all wars because we've learned our lessons, we'll never fight again. You know what happened to that, don't you? The armistice was signed because Germany were promised that Woodrow Wilson's 14 points would be the basis of the peace agreement. And the 14 points were actually brilliant. If the 14 points had been put into play, there would not have been a Second World War. When they came to Versailles, to the peace treaty, France said, no, we you've got to be paid for all the damage that's been done. And Britain said, no, we need to be paid too. And so 13 of the 14 points disappeared. The only one left was, of course, the League of Nations, which was an abysmal failure because Germany weren't allowed to be part of it for a start. And all of the broken promises from the armistice were the things Hitler used to get Germans to say, look, they're dishonest, you can't trust them, and that led to another war. In the church, I just tell you that because that affects the church quite dramatically. Liberalism is attacked, and scholars produce essays stating the truth, the biblical truth. The fundamentals were published from 1910 to 1915. Now, I haven't done enough copies for everybody, but there are copies there of what were in the fundamentals. Take one if you're interested. Well worth reading. I don't know where you get them anymore. They probably are available on the internet. I have a 4-volume copy, but there were 10 volumes in all. 4 volumes, put them all together. Now, basically essays by the great scholars of the day. They dealt with the issues of liberalism. So, James B.B. Warfield on the virgin birth deed of Christ. G. Campbell Morgan on the purposes of the incarnation. R.A. Torrey, personality and deity of the Holy Spirit. Dyson Haig, the history of higher criticism. And so it goes on. There's even one, a bishop from Bishop Ryle, J.C. Ryle. He'd been dead 10 or 15 years by this stage, but they plucked it out of one of his books and put it in there. Fascinating stuff. And it states orthodox belief, but the term was then used in a derogatory way to talk about fundamentalism. And fundamentalism became in the end a dirty word. Evangelicals are not fundamentalists in the sense that it's used, but they are fundamentalists in the sense of the fundamentals. It's very important to understand. It's not evangelical, it's different. And then there is major scholarship in England and America, and the University Press that I mentioned was at the forefront of that, trying to get university scholars to do proper studies and write proper books, evangelical scholars. Pentecostalism, very quickly, I'm going to run right out of time. Seeds were in Wesleyanism. By the end of the 19th century, it was opposed by most denominations, and so it became a separate movement. In rural America, we've already talked about the camp meetings and the circuit riders. It was emotionalism allied with a lack of education, with an emphasis on experience, the second blessing, tongues, healing. And so the Pentecostal movement started, the Assemblies of God and so on. It crept into the mainline churches, and it had a great deal of influence on the formal denominations. It was never acceptable in the Church of England and England, but the introduction of Pentecostalism into the Church of England actually gave it a whole new life, because it was based on music. Hillsong's made a fortune out of publishing music. The music is not like the old music. It often has no depth to it whatsoever, but it's a performance, it's interesting. The preaching is also a performance. When you go to a Pentecostal service, you are actually being entertained. If you ever look at a Hillsong service, I don't suggest you go there, you'll go deaf, but if you look at it, it's basically entertainment. Rock music, really loud, gets you in an emotional state. The preaching is not Bible exposition, it's emotional. Now, that has problems. Money problems, because there is no depth to things. Money problems can occur anywhere in the church, but it's a particular temptation there, as is sex. If everything is about emotions, sex is an emotion. Emotions are good, aren't they? There was an Anglican rector, I won't tell you where, who left his wife, he's charismatic, Pentecostal, left his wife, ran off with his secretary, and justified it, still was around a couple of years ago preaching in Pentecostal churches, by saying, I wouldn't have fallen in love with her if it wasn't God's plan.
That's the way.
Oh, wonderful! That's why they have problems. And then they have a massive turnover. They turn over their congregation in large numbers because, you see, if it's based on an experience, the experience has got to get better and better or it becomes boring. And so you get carried away in the early days, but eventually you start to think, oh, what's all this about? And you disappear. And so, yeah, they have a lot of people, but they have a lot of turnovers as well. 20th century, the great evangelist, Billy Sunday, 1862 to 1935. He was a baseballer who got converted in the 1880s and became an evangelist. And quite an interesting character. You can see him there preaching. You can't find a microphone. You see him there preaching. Look at him. And there are famous pictures of him standing on chairs and all sorts of things. His sermons were colloquial. There was frenetic delivery, as you can gather from those. But he had the largest crowd of any evangelist before the advent of sound systems. Supported prohibition, and there was never a scandal associated with his name. His wife was his campaign manager, and he was a very influential evangelist. I love reading the stories of him. I've got a couple of biographies which are really fantastic. But of course, the great evangelist was Billy Graham. He started out in Los Angeles in 1949 in a tent for a week. And then they extended. He held over by popular demand 6 great sin-smashing weeks. William Randolph Hearst was the great American newspaper tycoon, and nobody has ever understood why. And I've read books on him, I've read some of his papers. Nobody has ever understood why, but he ordered his editors to pump Graham. So all of the papers, when the first papers came out, wanted people to go and see Billy Graham. And that's why it went on and on and on. A lot of people were converted. There were Olympians, movie stars. One of the most famous was Stuart Hamlin, This Old House. Remember the song? Well, Stuart Hamlin was converted. Stuart Hamlin at that stage was a big radio star and had developed, he was an alcoholic, he was really in a bad way. His wife was a Christian. She suggested he go to hear Billy Graham. He refused. One night she dragged him along and he left halfway through the sermon. She dragged him along again and he heard whatever he heard changed his life. And he went, he actually went. He was so famous he was able to get in to see Billy Graham at night in his hotel room. And they spent 3 or 4 hours talking through things. And Stuart Hamlin was converted and then spent the rest of his radio career preaching Christianity. Not only wrote This Old House, but it is no secret what God can do. John Wayne said to him, "Did you give up alcohol like that?" Stuart Hamlin said, "No, I did." John Wayne said, "How?" Stuart Hamlin said, "It's no secret what God can do." And John Wayne said, "Write a song." And he did. So we owe John Wayne thanks for that. And that's the young Billy Graham preaching at Los Angeles. Very quickly, the ethics of the Graham campaign from the very start were all above board. When Graham conducted a crusade, he and his team never handled the money. Always held by the local churches, who would pay whatever was it cost to run the crusade, They might give the Billy Graham Association extra, but the books of every crusade were open to the public. Billy Graham's salary was always open to the public. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association books were always open to the public. The other thing that had affected a lot of evangelists was sex. Billy Graham's team would always go into a room before Billy Graham did. So you couldn't have somebody hiding in there to accuse him of any kind of misbehaviour. So the team went in before he did. Always. So there was never a sniff of scandal. He conducted worldwide crusades, even in Russia, incredibly successful. He had a whole lot of associate evangelists, Nathan Ford, T.W. Wilson and Joe Blinko, the most famous. He wrote lots and lots of books, the most famous being Peace with God. Had a magazine, Decision magazine, had a movie, Worldwide Pictures, which produced a number of great movies. Had a radio show, The Hour of Decision, had television shows. He was in the forefront of race relations in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the seabed of race riots and so on. Before the first night of the crusade, he walked in and found that there were ropes signifying white section, Negro section. He personally walked out and removed the ropes and said, "We will not have that sort of thing at my crusade." Way ahead of all of the others. He was a friend of presidents. His crusades were based on music. George Beverly Shea, Cliff Barrows. He really was responsible for starting Christianity Today magazine, the most significant evangelical magazine of today. And he started a number of education institutions, including the School of Evangelism at Wheaton College. Billy Graham, the big keynote was, "The Bible says." Sydney Crusade 1959, look at the people. And it really did transform Sydney. Cliff Barrows, Billy Graham, George Beverly Shea. His son-in-law, brother-in-law Leighton Ford, great evangelist, conducted a post-crusade crusade in Sydney, developed a crusade style, crusade organisation, was absolutely brilliant. I was part of that. That's Joe Blinko. I got my call to the ministry from Joe Blinko's preaching in Wollongong in 1962. How's that? In Wollongong show. And there is Billy Graham in a wheelchair with George W. Bush, who claims that Billy Graham changed his life. Very, very influential. Pre-organisation, before he came to a crusade, there was a whole lot of work went into it. There was counsel of training. For that alone, people actually, the counsel of training got them to know their Bible and how to talk to somebody about Jesus. It was very thorough. He did, 4 or 6 weeks of meetings, and then you had to go and get accredited. So the week after the last meeting, you had to go and actually be quizzed about what was going on. I remember doing that. Lots of friends came up to me. I was sitting at the thing, and one of the accreditors, and he's saying to friends, "What about this? What about that?" All right, I'll pass you. But yeah, it was good. There were detailed instructions for churches. Detailed instructions were incredible. The council training courses, they talked about the Bible. They also talked about take some minties or something to get a fresh breath, because there's nothing worse for a new convert than having bad breath. Really, really right down to detail. And then the follow-up, the success depended on local support. And I have told you about Annandale finding a book in the shed in the garage where the minister had listed the follow-up. There were, I don't know, something like 80 or 90 converts referred back to Annandale. And he had visited everyone at least once, some of them 3 or 4 times, and written all the details down. 10 years later, when I found the book, not one of those people was still at church. And I went back and had a look, and at the time of the crusade, the big thing in the parish paper was a fight over whether to move the organ from that side of the church to that side of the church. And people don't stay if there are fights going on. So the crusade was only as good as the local church. we're really running out of time, sorry. Anglicanism today. The Anglican Communion is a bunch of worldwide churches, 34 provinces, Australia being a province, and 4 united churches like the Church of South India and a couple of others. The Archbishop of Canterbury is a spiritual leader, put that in brackets for reasons I'll tell you in a minute. He has no power whatsoever except over Canterbury Diocese. The Lambeth Conference is held every 10 years, to which bishops from each of the provinces are invited. Earlier this year, Peter, Charlie and Sonia all went to the Lambeth Conference. Okay? Nobody from Sydney went. I'll explain why in a minute. The 1888 Lambeth Conference said Anglicanism was about the Bible, the Apostles' Creed, the 2 sacraments and the historic episcopate, and the Anglican Church has moved a long way from that. So in 2008, the Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans was formed. It was drawn together by the ordination of homosexuals, which Anglicans in various places were accepting, and that's not biblical. The African churches took the leading role. The first conference in 2008 was in Jerusalem. Other conferences have actually been in Africa. The African churches are far more life than the other churches. They formed a separate church in North America. The Anglican Church of the Southern Cone is a GAFCON church in South America. In 2019, the Church of Confessing Anglicans in Aotearoa. You want to vote for the voice? Note this. That's New Zealand, folks, but you're not allowed to call it New Zealand. No. Got to call it by the name. Sorry, that's political. 2022, of course, the Diocese of the Southern Cross here in Australia, when a parish broke from Brisbane Diocese. The 2023 GAFCON conference, well worth reading about. They called Archbishop Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a heretic. And they called on him to repent. And they said, we cannot be part of this anymore. Now that has implications for us. We've had GAFCON representatives at all of our evangelical meetings, and if Bishop Peter proceeds with same-sex blessings and all that sort of thing, there is every chance that there will be a split. But we will not go it alone, we will go it in GAFCON. Problem is, of course, we lose all our property and everything else, that's a big deal. Anglicanism in Australia, I want to finish on this, but don't think you're getting away early because there's a bit to do. In 1962, we got our own constitution. We're the Church of England and we're all tied to England and all that sort of thing. In 1962, we got our own constitution. Now, it's not that suddenly in 1962 we decided we wanted to be separate. The problem in 1962 was that was the end of a very long process. Because you see, the bulk of the Anglican Church in Australia was High Church. T.C. Hammond, the great fiery Irishman, and Broughton Knox, the principal of Mill College when I was a student there, a church lawyer, they both fought against it. And they fought against it until they got in the Constitution the things that protected us. So, for example, the 39 articles which are thoroughly biblical, they weren't to be part of it. And it was made clear that Sydney would not participate until they were part of it. That's one issue, for example. And so eventually the Constitution is actually not a bad Constitution. We got new prayer books. 1662, the Book of Common Prayer is still the basic prayer book of the Anglican Church of Australia. Technically, we can't do anything that is not part of it. Very sadly, when I got my licence for this diocese, Bishop Greg Thompson was the bishop, and he wouldn't post it. I had to go and get it off him personally. And the half hour he allowed, I think, stretched to about an hour and a half. We talked about a lot of things. One of the things he said to me is, One of the things that really upsets me is that very few of my clergy have ever used the prayer book. By that he meant 1662. And he said that means that things are happening that shouldn't be happening. And one of his visions, I mean, I walked out of there thinking, this guy's fantastic, but he'll never get to do any of the things he wants to do, and he didn't. One of his visions was to actually have a conference on the proper prayer book. And he actually said to me, would you speak at it? Yeah. But like a lot of things, he never got to do them. He was kicked out before that. In 1978, an Australian prayer book came out. AAPB, it should be not AAPB. Now the little green book. It was the first attempt. And it was very good, but you will find if you read the introduction, Don Robinson's name is not there, and yet he was the one who did most of the work. He actually resigned so that his name wouldn't be on it. Because he said, there are things in this prayer book which in 40 years' time, 50 years' time, we will regret. He's 100% right. Because all of the things he pointed out, Don Robbie didn't like driving at night. We work down here. Sorry.
She will turn the house down.
You know it's from his wife.
Stonewall Jackson. I was his best student in prayer book, so he used to get me to drive into places. So I actually used to get all this time in the car just with him. It was absolutely fantastic. So I know a lot more about his thinking than a lot of people do on this. But he later got a doctorate for his work on the prayer book, but he didn't want to be associated with it because he said it's going to lead us into trouble. And the reason it led us into trouble is you had the first order services, which were the old prayer book services modernised. That was fine. But then you had the second order services, which took you away from the old prayer book, put together the canon of the Mass. Now the problem is, people only use the second order service in dioceses like this. So now they no longer know what the prayer book says, they only know what that service says. So when you come to 1996 and a prayer book for Australia, which is the dark green thing we used to use here, they've gone the next step and allowed all sorts of things in. You notice we don't use it anymore. I was never going to do that. It's illegal in Sydney. Sydney Diocese never passed a law to allow it to be used. And Alex, fortunately, has had the courage to say, well, we're not going to use it either. You bring together the canon of the Mass. Now what happens is that between the old prayer book, separated canon of the Mass, so at the end of the consecration of the bread and the wine, you distribute it immediately. The second order service now puts other stuff in there. And if you watch genuine Anglo-Catholics, at that point they treat it as the body and blood of Christ and they worship. I think I've told you I was taking a service at Darling Point as a catechist, and the rector asked me to help him. Frank Woods, the Archbishop of Melbourne, was presiding. And after the consecration, he fell flat on the floor in front of the communion table. And I thought, the poor guy's had a stroke, you know. But no, he was worshipping the elements. That's the sort of problem. The lawyers have said we can't rule out same-sex blessings because we allowed the ordination of women. We allowed the ordination of women because we changed the rules after that's okay. The structure of the church has got a primate, who's the chief monkey, and that used to always be the Archbishop of Sydney. Now it's a senior Archbishop. It's currently the Archbishop of Adelaide, I think. You have General Synod, which is set up so that whatever it decides is not binding on the church. Each diocese, after General Synod, has to come back and pass a motion allowing the General Synod motion, which has caused all sorts of strife in Sydney in particular. You've got 23 dioceses. There is an archbishop in each capital city, except Hobart and Darwin. And you've got bishops, and you've got bishops, assistant bishops. And then you've got the parish, which, as I keep telling you, is the centre of everything. But that's the Sydney diocesan doctrine. It's also the biblical doctrine, but that's another story. So, there is the church in Australia. Started in Sydney, but very early on, I've got the dates here somewhere, I didn't really get around to doing all of this properly, but in 1847, that's what it is. In 1847, the Diocese of Newcastle was formed under William Tyrrell, and he was the bishop of everything there. The Diocese of Melbourne was then formed. Sydney got rid of most of New South Wales eventually, which creates tensions now because Sydney was really well endowed and the other parish dioceses are saying, hang on, why don't we get some of the money? And that's why Bathurst, they ran into major financial problems, and Sydney had to bail them out, which meant that Sydney had a say in the election of a new bishop, and so a more college man is now Bishop of Bathurst. Not the first one, Bruce Wilson was Bishop of Bathurst, but Mark Calder is really, I hope, making a difference. Now, essentially, and I'm not going to go through them, I've got notes on all of them, and I won't go through them all. Essentially, the Queensland Diocese, Brisbane, then they carved out North Queensland, then Rockhampton, and Northern Territory only came into being a couple of years ago. Riverina was carved out of Cairn-Goulburn, that's it. And these were carved out of Armidale. Now, Sydney has always been evangelical. The first bishop, William Grant Broughton, was an Oxford movement man, so it wasn't evangelical. Bishop Frederick Barker came as an evangelical and made it evangelical. Now, it will be well worth reading the biography of William Barker, of Frederick Barker, when it's finally published, if it's ever published. It's currently running to 33 chapters, and I am trying to convince Grant that it'll never be published like that. It's brilliant. Grant's work is brilliant, but it's just too detailed. And he's tells me he's already written the first few chapters after my criticism. But it really is superb, and it really is worth reading. I just hope he gets it finished, he gets it revised, and he gets it published. But Frederick Barker is the great figure there. We then went through a bit of a wishy-washy period until Howard Mole came, and with him T.C. Hammond. And that made Sydney the most evangelical diocese in the world, and they fight to keep it that way. Melbourne has had its periods of evangelicalism, but basically it coexists with evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics and Liberals. And there's about a third of each, and they coexist and they take concerns. Peter Watson, who was a bishop in Sydney, became Archbishop of Melbourne for 5 years. They'd only be cheap if they did. Armidale was a high church up until Clive Curl was made bishop. Clive Curl, of course, from Sydney. He was made bishop in 1965, and he, with the assistance of John Chapman, completely changed Armidale. It is now a thoroughly evangelical diocese. We'll only elect evangelical bishops, and the bulk of the churches are evangelical. There may be one or two. The rest are fairly Anglo-Catholic. Northwestern Australia is largely evangelical because it doesn't count for much, there's not many people there. But it has also had evangelical bishops for much of its history. Bishop of the Diocese of Ballarat, which is 5, Edinburgh, 4, Wangaratta, I think. No, Wangaratta's really high church. It must be Bendigo. Has Matthew Brainerd, the son of Peter Brainerd, was Bishop of Armidale. He wasn't trained in Moore College, but he is evangelical. Tasmania is extra, it doesn't belong to any of these. It's had a couple of evangelical bishops recently, and Canberra Goulburn even had an evangelical bishop. The evangelicals are becoming more and more prominent in the church. Newcastle Diocese, and I really ran out of time. There's a brilliant history of Newcastle Diocese by A.P. Elkin, a lecturer at Newcastle University. You can't get it anywhere unless you go up to the University Library or the Newcastle Library. Sadly, it's not an e-book, and it's been 30 years since I read it, but it really is a very good history book. Newcastle has been interesting. William Tyrrell, yes, he was not an evangelical, but he was an old-fashioned churchman and a pastor. If you're bishop of all this area, visiting your clergy is not an easy task, and he did it. And Newcastle has had, through its history, evangelical churches. There's a book by, I'll tell you what it looks like, I can't remember, Robinson, anyway, which looks at evangelical churches in Newcastle in the 19th century. And he has recently brought that up to date. His new stuff hasn't been published. But there are a number of evangelical churches, and they've changed. St Philip's Waratah used to be evangelical at one stage. Went from that. There are other churches that have always been high churches. There was a move under Alf Holland to get rid of evangelicals, and so what he did, he appointed to Merriweather, which was the big evangelical church, Kirkaldy, which was another big evangelical church. In fact, he appointed Anglo-Catholics. Merriweather, it worked. Kirkaldy didn't, because the guy that he put there with a fruitcake had a breakdown, and he had to be replaced. Colvin Ford came, who was a nice guy. He wasn't thoroughly evangelical, but he tried to preach biblical sermons. Arthur Copeman was his curate, and so eventually it became thoroughly evangelical. And 12 months ago, a new rector was appointed to Merriweather, who is a strong evangelical. He came from St Clement's Hospital. He's having a tough time, but eventually that will change. Look, I don't have time to do anything else. Where to from here? I don't know. I don't know. But in my understanding of church history, I don't think Anglicanism has a great deal of future in this diocese. Evangelicals are the most prosperous parishes in the diocese, but Anglicanism itself is in many ways against modern society. People don't want prayer books, don't want formal services, which is what we have and what we like. So I think the independent churches are going to grow at the expense of Anglicans. Not enough Presbyterian churches on the coast to make a difference. The Uniting Church is on its way out. Pentecostals will probably continue to grow, but will not have any sort of lasting effect. The church worldwide is under threat. So unless GAFCON and the evangelicals who get together can succeed in their fight to return us to the Bible, the worldwide church is in serious trouble. So my understanding of church history is that we're in one of those down periods. But as I've tried to show you through the 2 lots of lectures, the downs then lead to ups. The down of the 17th century, the down of the 15th century led to the Reformation. The down of the 17th century led to the Great Awakening. Our downs will eventually lead to a new awakening, but we won't get to see. trust in God and see that His people are blessed, and that as long as we keep proclaiming the Bible as the Word of God, Satan will never get rid of us. I've now gone 5 minutes over time, 2 lectures over time. Tough, I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
Yay!